The French Revolution was one of the most dramatic events in modern European history, and also one of the most complex. The date frequently associated with the revolution is the 14th of July, 1789, when a notorious prison, the Bastille, was stormed in Paris. This date and event came to symbolize the downfall of the old order and the forced acceptance by the French monarchy of limited democracy. From that point onwards, the pace of change increased, and the French people and their institution experienced enormous upheavals, resulting in war, civil war, persecution, execution, dictatorship, and economic chaos. The origin of the revolution was due to a combination of political, economic, and social factors. During the old regime, there were a number of deep-rooted problems that affected successive royal governments. These problems influenced the way France was governed, particularly the taxation system. It also influenced the carefully ordered yet deeply divided structure of French society. It influenced the gradual spread of ideas which started to challenge this structure. These deep-rooted problems can be seen as long-term causes of the French Revolution, and in order to understand them fully, it is necessary to understand the nature of French society before 1789, namely the structure of the royal government, the taxation system, the structure of French society, and the Enlightenment. France before 1789 was an absolute monarchy ruled by the House of Bourbon. This meant that the authority of the French crown was not limited by any representative body, such as an elected parliament. The king was responsible only to God and answerable to no one on earth. This system of government is also known as absolutism. In such a system, the personality and character of the king is very important, as it sets the tone for the style of government. In the century before the outbreak of the Revolution, there were only three French kings: Louis XIV, Louis XV, and Louis XVI. Louis XV said in 1766 that sovereign power resides in my person alone. The power of legislation belongs to me alone. It's my imitation of Louis XV. There were limits, however, although their power was absolute. Kings were bound by laws and customs of the kingdom. For example, there were many independent bodies, such as the Assembly of the Clergy, which had rights and privileges guaranteed by law. The king could not interfere with these. The king also had to consult his council of ministers and advisors to make laws. This meant considerable power was in the hands of a small number of men. The most important of these was the Controller General, who was in charge of royal finances. Each minister dealt with the king on an individual basis and did not form part of a cabinet system of government. In the provinces, the king's government was carried out by the intendants, who had far-reaching powers. In 1774, Louis XVI, the grandson of Louis XV, acceded to the French throne. The new king was well-intentioned but never came to terms with the state's financial problems. In an absolute system, the monarch needed to be strong with a dominant personality. Louis, although well-intentioned, was rather weak and indecisive. Governments rely on taxation so as to provide them with an adequate income, but the taxation system in France was both chaotic and inefficient. They had direct taxes, which were paid directly to the government, and most of those taxes were paid by the peasantry, with the church and the aristocracy exempt from it. Then you had indirect taxes over a wide range of things like food and drink and salt and even goods entering a town. And then the system of collecting the taxes was broken and inefficient and very corrupt. It was called tax farming. This is where a company actually was hired to collect the taxes, and they agreed then to pay the king a certain sum of money. If they collected taxes above that sum, they got to keep that. So as a result, most people knew that their taxes never reached the treasury. On his ascension in 1774, Louis XVI was aware of many of the problems affecting the finances of the state. He appointed a man named Turgot as Controller General. He was influenced by ideas of the Enlightenment and embarked on a reform program. His attempts to abolish the trade guilds and reform the tax system provoked such a storm of protest from the parliaments and other interested parties that Louis, for the sake of harmony, fired him. The bulk of the royal revenue was made up of taxation, yet because of the system was in all the exemptions, the crown was denied an adequate income from which to govern the country. In order to meet the demands of war, the crown was forced to borrow money. The tax collective system, called tax farming, meant that not all the revenue paid actually reached the treasury. The issue of taxation weakened the crown and created resentment among the Third Estate. This was one of the most important of the long-term causes of the revolution. Take down this chart really quick. This is a lists the different taxes, gives a description, tells whether they are direct or indirect, and then of course right away you see who was taxed. You know, the Third Estate is going to hold this. This says in theory second and third. That's because the second rarely paid it. And then yet they're paying the burden of direct taxes and then again the indirect taxes as well. So you can see from the system it's completely unfair. French society in the 18th century was divided into three orders known as the estates of the realm. The first two estates had many privileges that they frequently used to the disadvantage of the Third Estate. Over the course of the 18th century, divisions appeared between the estates, and this became a long-term cause of the revolution. The first estate was the clergy, which consisted of members of religious orders and parish priests. A number of issues contributed to the church being unpopular with many people: plurality and absenteeism, tithes, its exemption from taxes, and its power over the people. Many younger sons of noble families entered the church and occupied its higher posts, such as bishops and archbishops, which provided large incomes. Some bishops held more than one bishopric, which meant they were bishops over more than one diocese. This is called plurality. And many never even visited their diocese, called absenteeism. This made the church very unpopular with many ordinary people. The wealth of the church came from the land it owned and the tithes that people paid. It was the largest single landowner in France, owning about 10% of the land. The tithe was paid to the church each year by landowners and was based on the proportion of crops they produced. In some areas, this could be as little as 10%, and in others, it could be almost as much as 25%. Tithes were supposed to provide for parish priests, poor relief, and the upkeep of church buildings, but much of it went instead into the pockets of the bishops and the abbots. This was greatly resented by both the peasantry and ordinary clergy. The church had many privileges apart from collecting the tithe. By far the most important of these was its exemption from taxation. This added to its unpopularity. Its income from property was immense, and instead of paying taxes, the church agreed to make an annual payment which it determined. It was usually under about 5% of the church's total income. France was a very religious country, and Catholicism was the official state religion. The influence of the church was considerable and touched many areas of people's lives. It had wide-ranging powers of censorship over books, which were critical of the church, provided poor relief, hospitals, and schools, and kept a list in the parish of all births, marriages, and deaths. At a time when communication in general was very poor, the church acted as a sort of ministry of information for the government. When parish priests informed their congregations about various policies and initiatives, they were in a sense serving as the voice piece of the king. The vast wealth of the church and its resistance to new ideas made it unpopular with many people, which contributed to the long-term causes of the revolution. Of the three estates, the nobility was the most powerful. Unlike the British nobility, which numbered hundreds, the French nobility numbered hundreds of thousands. The most powerful were those that could trace their ancestors back to before 1400. The second were administrators in the government, and the remainder lived in the country in various states of prosperity under something called the law of primogeniture, which meant that a landed estate was inherited by the eldest son. This left younger sons to fend for themselves, and many joined the church or the army. In addition to holding most jobs in the state, the nobility had many privileges. They were tried in special courts, they were exempt from military service, they were exempt from paying some taxes, and in many areas had a monopoly right to operate mills, ovens, and wine presses. Perhaps their greatest privilege was exemption from taxation. Until 1695, they did not pay direct taxes at all. In that year, the capitation was introduced, and in 1749, a poll tax. Even with these, they had to pay less than the other estates. Joining the nobility was not always easy, but there were various ways of becoming a noble, besides the obvious one of inheritance. One of the main ways of acquiring noble status was either by direct appointment from the king or by buying certain offices that carried hereditary titles. Although the nobility formed a distinct and separate order, it was not inaccessible to men of wealth and social ambition. In essence, the Third Estate consisted of everyone who did not belong to one or other of the two privileged estates. At the top were rich merchants, industrialists, and business people. This group of rich commoners, who were not peasants or urban workers, is frequently referred to as the bourgeoisie. They were by far the wealthiest. At the other extreme of the Third Estate were the peasantry. They were by far the most numerous section of French society, comprising about 85% of the population. This group, however, covered enormous variations in wealth and status. At the top end was a small group of large farmers who owned their own land, employed laborers, and grew for the market. But more numerous were the laborers who existed at or near subsistent levels. And in some parts of France, serfdom continued to exist. They were at the bottom of the social structure, and their children were unable to inherit even personal property without paying considerable fees to their feudal lord. Poor peasants lived in continuous uncertainty. Bad weather or illness could push them into the ranks of vagrants who lived by begging, stealing, and occasional employment. In many ways, the peasants bore the burden of taxation, and this made them extremely resentful. All peasants had to pay tithe to the church, feudal dues to their lord, and taxes to the state. Nearly all land was subject to feudal dues. These included a variety of very costly payments. A further grievance was that the peasant could be tried in a regular court where the lord acted as both judge and jury. Taxes to the state kept accumulating and accumulating until the peasant had very little left to feed their family. The increased demand for farms with the result that landlords could raise rents. The increasing financial burden placed on the peasantry, along with growing resentment of the feudal system, was an important long-term cause of the revolution. The remaining part of the Third Estate was made up of urban workers. Small property owners and artisans in Paris were known as the sans-culottes. The majority of workers in the towns lived in crowded, insanitary housing blocks known as tenements. They were unskilled and poor. In the years immediately preceding the revolution, the worsening economic situation caused considerable resentment among urban dwellers and contributed to the long-term causes of the revolution. During the course of the 18th century, there emerged in Europe an intellectual movement of writers and thinkers known as the Enlightenment. The movement questioned and challenged a whole range of views and ideas that at the time were widely accepted, particularly relating to religion, nature, and absolute monarchy. Their analysis of society was based on reason and rational thought, rather than superstition and tradition. In France, they were known as the philosophes and were writers rather than philosophers. The most famous were Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. The aim of the philosophes was to apply rational analysis to all activities. They were not prepared to accept tradition or revelation. The philosophes, which were clearly critical of many aspects of the old regime, were not essentially opposed to the regime. They were not therefore revolutionary, yet they did have an impact on the outbreak of the revolution. Their ideas attacked all the assumptions on which the old regime was based. They challenged and helped undermine one of the key pillars of the old order, namely the position of the church and the role of the king as God's servant. Although not revolutionary themselves, their ideas and approaches did influence many who would become revolutionaries. In the 10 years before the outbreak of the revolution in 1789, there were a number of issues, problems, and events that contributed to the downfall of the old regime and should be viewed alongside the long-term causes. The main short-term causes were foreign policy, the financial crisis, and the economic crisis. Since the 15th century, France had had a hostile relationship with both Great Britain and Austria. Britain was viewed as France's only serious colonial rival, and Austria was a rival for the dominance of mainland Europe. By the middle of the 18th century, France and Austria had resolved their differences and were allies when the 7 Years' War broke out in 1756. During the course of this war, French forces in India and North America suffered a series of crushing defeats at the hands of the British. More of France's overseas territories were lost in 1763, although the profitable sugar-producing islands of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and some of the lesser territories were retained. Following this humiliation at the hands of Britain and her ally Prussia, the French government dreamt of revenge. The opportunity came when Britain became involved in a bitter quarrel with her 13 North American colonies who rebelled against British rule. In the resulting American War of Independence, France intervened on the side of the rebels, providing both financial and military support, including the Marquis de Lafayette. The intervention of France in 1778 was decisive and helped bring about the defeat of British forces and the creation of the United States of America. Although France was unable to recover most of the territory lost during the 7 Years' War, the Treaty of Versailles in 1783 did satisfy French honor. Few at the time, however, could foresee what the real cost of the war would turn out to be: revolution in France. The war cost a great deal of money, and in the short term worsened the already weak financial situation of the crown. French soldiers who had fought in the war had been exposed to ideas such as liberty and democracy, and many demanded similar rights for the people of France. The primary short-term cause of the French Revolution was the financial crisis. By far the most important aspect of this was the huge deficit that the government was building up. There were two main reasons to explain why there was a deficit and a financial crisis in France. The first reason is war. Between 1740 and 1783, France is at war for 20 years, first in the War of Austrian Succession, then the 7 Years' War, and finally the American War of Independence. The cost of helping the American colonists defeat the British government was approximately 10,606 million livres. This was mainly achieved through Necker's efforts in raising loans, rather than imposing new taxes. While this did not directly lead to revolution, the lack of an elected parliament to guarantee loans, as in Britain, did not give lenders confidence. The other reason was taxes. The crown was not receiving much of the money collected in taxes, and until it recovered control of its finances, no basic reforms could be carried out. The privileged classes whose income from property had increased were an untapped source of revenue that the crown urgently needed to access. There would, however, be powerful resistance to any change in the taxation structure. Various proposals for reforming the financial situation were proposed in the years leading up to the French Revolution, but none of them were able to really succeed. The obvious body to summon to approve the reforms, that was the representation of the nation, was the States General, but this was rejected as being too unpredictable. In the years immediately preceding the outbreak of the Revolution in 1789, the French economy faced a number of crises. The economy was largely based on agriculture, and this sector had grown steadily throughout the 1730s to the 1770s. Good harvests had resulted in food surpluses, which in turn led to an increase in population. But during the 1780s, the general agricultural prosperity came suddenly to an end. This was brought about in no small measure by a series of disastrous harvests, followed by a very weird wet spring and a freak hailstorm. This was particularly disastrous for peasants. A bad harvest in a pre-industrial society always led to massive unemployment. The resulting rise in the price of food led to less demand for manufactured goods at a time when both peasants and urban workers needed employment more than ever to cope with the higher prices. The impact on staple foods such as bread was significant. Over the period of 1726 to 1789, wheat prices increased by about 60%. Textile industries and other such factories also had massive unemployment. Unemployment was rising at the same time as the cost of living, and as production was either stagnant or falling, workers were unable to increase their wages. Many ordinary people blamed tithe owners and landowners for making the situation worse. There's my dog. Landowners were accused of hoarding grain and speculating on prices rising during times of shortages, therefore contributing to a lack of food. In many areas, there were food riots and disturbances as people attacked grain stores. They were most frequent in the spring and summer of 1789 when grain prices were at their peak before the new harvest had been collected. It was believed by many ordinary people in both rural and urban areas that the economic crisis was in part the fault of the nobility. Increasing disturbances among the nobility encouraged many ordinary people to take the first tentative step towards direct political action. The politicalization of the majority of the Third Estate began as a result of the economic crisis. Louis's handling of the political crisis further exasperated the situation in the eyes of the ordinary people. The deep-rooted, long-term problems of the old regime, considered in the first part of this video, came to a head in the years immediately preceding 1789. Short-term causes such as poor harvest and rising bread prices helped to bring this about. The attempts at reform were an acknowledgement that changes were needed. The failure of the process showed the depth of the divisions within French society. When the French monarchy declared itself bankrupt, the way was paved for the calling of an Estates General.